Hi, and you're very welcome to today's Saturday session for Junior Cycle Science, and we're going to be looking at the circulatory system throughout today's Saturday session. Now, throughout the circulatory system, we're going to be looking at the three main parts that compose the circulatory system. The first part we have is the blood. We have our blood vessels in which the blood is going to travel, and then we also have our heart, which is responsible for pumping the blood around our bodies. Now, when we look at the blood vessels, we're going to see that it's broken down into our veins, our capillaries, and our arteries, and we'll look at what each one of those does and what their role is in relation to the circulatory system. And we can see it over here in the diagram. So we have our heart, which is responsible for pumping the blood around our body. We have all of these blood vessels which exist throughout our entire body, and then within that we have our blood. Now, just noticing the diagram there to start off with, you'll see that some of the blood vessels are illustrated in blue, some of them are illustrated in red, and we'll see in the next couple of minutes why this is done. So, when we talk about the blood, we can see that it consists of four different parts. We have our plasma, we have our red blood cells, we have our white blood cells, and we have our platelets. And each one of those has a unique function in relation to the circulatory system. Now, if we were to get a sample of blood and place it into a centrifuge is just a device, so it's just interesting to know. It's a device that spins samples at a very high speed. Now, why this is really useful in terms of the blood is if we were to place a sample of blood into the centrifuge, it will actually separate the blood into its four distinct components. So we have our plasma, we have our white blood cells, we have our platelets, and we have our red blood cells. Now, the plasma is the liquid part, which we can see up here. It's kind of a straw colour. You can still see through it, and it accounts for about 55% of the component of the blood. Red blood cells account for about 45% of the blood. That's what gives the blood its red colour. And white blood cells and platelets together are less than 1%. Okay, so plasma is the majority of the blood. Most of it is the liquid form. Red blood cells are the second most abundant, and white blood cells and platelets are the least amount that we have within our blood. Now, the plasma, we've already mentioned how it's the liquid part of the blood, and generally it's going to consist of a couple of different things. It's mostly going to be consisting of water. Okay, it's the liquid part of the blood. It's going to consist of water, and it's also going to contain some dissolved substances as well. So some of those substances would be glucose, which can be transported around the body in our blood vessels, amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and carbon dioxide there as well. So we want to eventually eliminate that carbon dioxide from our bodies because it is a waste product. We don't want it to harm our bodies on the inside, so it will be transported around in the plasma again. So just remembering the plasma accounts for about 55% of the blood, and it's composed of water and does contain some other dissolved substances as well. The red blood cells then. So the red blood cells are red because of this substance they have, which is called hemoglobin. Okay, so hemoglobin has one metallic substance as part of it, which is iron, and this is responsible for carrying the oxygen around the body. Now we're going to focus in on the shape for a couple of minutes, and we can see here that the shape is referred to as being biconcave. Now, if a surface is concave, we can see that it will curve inwards like it does down here. Okay, so that's concave. Red blood cells are known as biconcave discs, bi meaning two, because not only does it have a concave shape on one side, it also has the concave shape on the other side as well. And we can see that in the diagram over here. So if you can imagine you have your red blood cells, if it was pinched in on both sides, concave on this side, it's also going to be concave on the other side as well. And the reason this is done is if it's concave, it increases the surface area. So if you can imagine we had a surface that was just straight across, we can see here, the surface area here is going to be far less than the surface area up here in the concave shape. So if we can increase the surface area, it means that these red blood cells are going to be able to carry more oxygen. Again, their function is to carry oxygen around our bodies. We want that oxygen to be delivered to all of the cells so that they can function as efficiently as possible. So the more oxygen that they can carry, the better for us. And it's that concave shape on both sides, the biconcave discs, that are going to ensure that the red blood cells can do that. The white blood cells, if we have a look at the diagram over here, first of all, So there's our red blood cells. We can see the biconcave discs, so we'll just label those. The white blood cells are much larger. Okay, so they're much larger and they're also far less in number, because if you can remember, the red blood cells accounted for roughly 5% of the constituents of the blood. The white blood cells was less than 1% when combined with the platelets. So there really isn't as many of these when compared to the red blood cells, but they're really, really important for us. Okay, their function, they're going to fight infection in two ways for us. One of them is they're going to engulf and destroy any bacteria that might be existing inside our bodies. So the white blood cells will move up towards where the bacteria is, they will engulf them, so take them inside the white blood cells and then destroy them with chemicals that exist inside the white blood cells. And they're also going to produce antibodies there as well. So antibodies are chemicals which our body can produce to fight off any infection that might be there in our bodies, which could make us sick. Okay, so the white blood cells, even though they're far less in number, really, really important for us because it's going to help us to fight infection. Platelets then, quite simply, the function of these is just going to be to clot the blood. So we can see the platelets here again, they're very, very small in number. So with the white blood cells, they account for less than 1% of the components of the blood. But again, they're hugely important for us because if we were ever to suffer a cut or an injury, it's the platelets that are going to make sure that we don't lose an awful lot of blood. So these platelets are going to ensure that clots are produced to make sure that no blood is going to escape from our bodies. So here is an exam question which has popped up before, so we'll have a quick look at this and see what answers will be suitable for this. And it's just asked us to state the function of white blood cells and state the function of red blood cells. So the function of white blood cells is to protect against disease or infection. And the red blood cells, the function of those is to carry oxygen around the body to all of our cells. Okay, so nice short questions there, didn't need too much detail, just mentioning against protecting against infection or disease and carrying oxygen around our bodies. The next structure we're going to look at as part of the circulatory system is the heart. And the function of the heart is quite simply just to pump blood all around the body. So we're going to look at it in a couple of minutes how there's two different circuits. One is going to be pumping blood to the lungs, the other is going to be pumping blood all around the body. But to make sure that our heart is able to do the job that it does, we need a very specific type of muscle inside our hearts. And this type of muscle is known as cardiac muscle. So obviously our heart is primarily responsible for keeping us alive, pumping blood all around our bodies, so we don't want our heart to stop. So we need a very specific type of muscle which is going to keep working and working and working and never get tired. And that's why cardiac muscle is suited for our heart, because it doesn't get tired. It doesn't tire easily, so it's going to make sure that our heart is constantly pumping the blood. Now we're going to look at the structure of the heart, and before we look at the more detailed structure, we're going to break it down into 4 simplified chambers. Okay, so we can see here we have 4 chambers. We have 2 chambers up here at the top, and we have 2 chambers down here at the bottom. Now the first thing you're going to notice when you're looking at this diagram is as we're looking at it, right is on the left hand side of the diagram as we're looking at it, and the words left is on the right hand side of the diagram as we're looking at it. So I'm just going to write a little note here. So this is just for when we're labeling the heart. So label as if you're looking down at your chest at your own heart. So if you were looking down at your own chest, this would be the left-hand side, this would be the right-hand side. So it looks a little bit different as we're looking straight into our heart. So if we look at the 4 different chambers, we can see that the chambers up at the top, we have our left atrium and our right atrium. Plural, that's going to be the atria, so our left and right atria. And down at the bottom, we have our left and our right ventricles. So just for now, simplified version of the heart, at the top, we have our 2 atria, our left atrium and our right atrium. and down at the bottom we have our two ventricles, our left ventricle and our right ventricle. Just to notice for the size there as well, the atria, so the chambers at the top of the heart, are smaller than the ventricles, which are the chambers at the bottom of the heart. Now, obviously, when we're drawing a label diagram of the heart, we're not going to shape it like is here. This is just to see where the four chambers are. It's a simplified version just to show the two main chambers at the top and the two main chambers at the bottom. When we're labeling our diagram in a couple of minutes, we'll be drawing a much more scientific version. Now, again, ignoring the chambers for now, we're going to look at the four main blood vessels that exist within the heart. So before we get into that, I'm just going to mention here how we have veins and we have arteries. We'll have a discussion on this in a couple of minutes anyway, but veins are the blood vessels that carry blood to the heart, and arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. And if we look at the word away and the word arteries, we can see there that there's a letter A in artery and a letter A in away. Okay, so that will help you to remember that. Now, there's one other keyword that we have here, and that's pulmonary as well. So I'm just going to explain here the idea of something being pulmonary. So we're pulmonary artery or pulmonary vein. Just remember that that's related to the lungs. So if you ever see the word pulmonary, it's in some way, shape or form referring to being related to the lungs. Now, the reason we have a pulmonary artery and a pulmonary vein is because the blood is either going to be going to the lungs or coming back from the lungs, but we'll see that in a couple of minutes. So over here on the left-hand side, we can see we have our vena cava. It's a vein, V for vena cava, V for vein, and we know that because the arrow is pointing into the heart, so the blood is coming to the heart. Here we have our pulmonary artery, and the arrow is pointing away from the heart. Again, this is because it's an artery, it's bringing blood away from the heart. We then have our aorta, again, A for aorta, A for artery, A for away. It's bringing blood out of the heart, it's bringing blood away from the heart. And over here on the far right hand side, it's the left hand side of our heart as we're actually labelling it, but the right hand side as we're looking at the diagram here, we have our pulmonary vein. And again, we know this is a vein because the blood is coming into the heart. Okay, it's carrying blood to the heart. So again, that's just a simplified version. We have our four chambers in the background and we have four main blood vessels. Two of them are bringing blood to the heart, they're both veins. Two of them are bringing blood away from the heart, they're both arteries. Now, this is the proper scientific version of our heart, which exists inside of our bodies. Again, we're going to look for all of the structures which we have seen up to this point. So we can see we have our right atrium and our right ventricle. So these are the chambers at the top and the bottom of the heart. So right hand side, but left hand side as we're looking at it. But again, we're pretending we're looking down our own heart. So right atrium, right ventricle. Over on the other side, we have our left atrium up at the top and our left ventricle down here at the bottom. Now here we have our first vein. It's bringing blood to the heart. It's our vena cava. We're going to look at the blood flow in a couple of minutes, but the blood is going to come into the atrium, down into the ventricle, and then back out away from the heart through the pulmonary artery. Same thing is going to happen over here on the other side, the left-hand side of the heart, but the right-hand side as we're looking at the diagram. So it's going to come into the heart through the pulmonary vein. So veins bring blood to the heart, into the atrium, down into the ventricle, and back out through the aorta, away from the heart, because the aorta is an artery. Now, a couple of other labels here as well. This structure here in the center is known as the septum. Okay, that divides the heart into its left and its right sides. And one other thing just to notice here as well, the left-hand side, if we were to look at it, we can see that the walls down here are a little bit thicker than the right-hand side. Okay, so the left-hand side of the heart is thicker than the right-hand side of the heart. So I'm just going to write a little note on that. And the reason for that is the left side pumps blood all around the body. And the right side only pumps it as far as the lungs. Okay, so you can imagine if this side of the heart is pumping to the lungs, and you can imagine how close the heart is in proximity to the lungs, it doesn't have all that far to go at all. okay? Whereas the left-hand side over here, it has to pump blood all around the body, so to everywhere else in the body. That's a much greater distance for it to have to travel. It's going to have to be pumped at a higher pressure to make sure that it gets there. So the left-hand side of the heart is going to be that little bit thicker to ensure that that can happen. Now, if we have a look at this here, that's going to pretty much explain it for us anyway. But we can see here that the circulatory system is broken into two circuits. We have our pulmonary circuit. Again, the idea of pulmonary being related to the lungs. And then we have our systemic circuit, so it's going through all the other system. It's going to everywhere else in the body. Okay, so again, why is the left-hand side of the heart that little bit thicker than the right? Well, the blood has to be pumped all around the body, whereas over here on the right-hand side, it only has to go as far as the lungs. Now, towards the start, I mentioned how the blood and the blood vessels are going to be depicted in two colours, usually within science. They're either going to be red or they're going to be blue. If you see the colour blue, that normally depicts deoxygenated blood. And if you see red, that's oxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood is blood that has very little oxygen. Oxygenated blood is blood that has lots of oxygen. So let's try and relate this to the structure of the heart. So we know over here on the right-hand side, left-hand side as we're looking at it, blood is going to come into the heart through our vein, which is our vena cava. We can see that over here. So it's going to come into our vena cava. It's going to go down into the ventricle, in through the vena cava, into the atrium, down into the ventricle, and it's going to leave through the pulmonary artery. Why is this now known as the pulmonary artery? Well, first of all, it's an artery because it's bringing blood away from the heart, but it's known as the pulmonary artery because it's bringing blood away from the heart to the lungs. Now, what's going to happen here? We have very little oxygen in the blood at the minute. It's coloured in blue. That's what's telling us that. Why would we bring that to the lungs? Well, we're after taking a deep breath in, we're after breathing in loads and loads of oxygen. We want that oxygen to get into our bloodstream so it can be sent to all of the cells around our body. So by sending this deoxygenated blood to our lungs, we can fill it with oxygen and it will move from being deoxygenated blood to oxygenated blood, which is why it's now depicted here in red. Exact same thing is going to happen here. It's going to leave from the lungs. It's going to come in here through our pulmonary vein. Why is it known as a pulmonary vein? Well, first of all, it's a vein because it's bringing blood to the heart, and it's known as the pulmonary vein because it's coming from the lungs. So anything related to the lungs, again, is going to be pulmonary. So the pulmonary vein here, into our left atrium over here, it's going to move down into our left ventricle, and eventually it's going to leave from an artery known as the aorta, and it's going to be pumped all around the body. And again, this side of the heart is going to be a little bit thicker than the other side because as it leaves through the aorta, it has to be pumped all around the body. Now, that oxygen is going to be used up by all of our cells. So once again, when it's used up, it's going to move from being oxygenated blood back to being deoxygenated blood with very little oxygen. So it'll have to come back up, back into our right atrium, back into our right ventricle, and eventually it's going to have to leave from our pulmonary artery to go back up to the lungs once again so it can pick up more oxygen. And this will happen again and again and again. So we're going to have a quick look at this exam question then based off of that. So the blood vessels marked A and B carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so there's actually a little hint there for us because it's saying away, we know that both of these have to be arteries. So if we have a look at this one here, first of all, remember deoxygenated blood is on this side of the heart. So it's going to come in here, that was our vena cava. Eventually it's going to leave to go up to the lungs through this artery, but because it's going to the lungs in an artery, it's going to be the pulmonary artery. And then what's the other artery that we have in our heart? It's going to be the aorta. Okay, so a nice little exam question there, just testing our knowledge of the blood vessels. And this exactly is what we're going to be focusing on here. So there are three main types of blood vessels. We have our veins, which we've already pretty much talked about. We have our arteries and we have our capillaries. But what is the difference other than just veins bringing blood to the heart and arteries bringing blood away from the heart? Well, if we look at the structure of the arteries and the veins, we can see that they actually have the exact same structures within them. The main difference is the size of the structures. So the artery is over here on the left-hand side, the vein is over here on the right-hand side, and the first thing you're going to notice is the size of this thick wall that they're talking about, okay, or the wall. So we have a thick wall here in the artery, we have a thin wall over here in the vein. So that's a muscular wall. And we can see that in the artery, it's much thicker than it is in the vein. Now, because it's much thicker, it means here that the hole or the gap that we have, which is known as the lumen, is much narrower, and the lumen is where the blood is going to flow through. Over here, because we have a thinner wall in the vein, the lumen is going to be much wider. Okay, and there's a very specific reason for that. So if you can imagine the arteries, the blood is going to be pumped at a really high pressure. Because if you think of the distance that the blood has to be pumped to so that all of the cells can get some oxygen from the blood, we have to make sure that it's a strong enough pressure in order to be able to do that. And if we have a narrower lumen in at the centre, it's going to allow the blood to be pumped at a much higher pressure. The vein is just returning the blood back to the heart, so it doesn't have to be pumped at a much higher pressure because it's going to get there eventually anyway. So the arteries pump blood at a much higher pressure, so they're going to have the thicker wall and the narrower lumen to allow for that to happen. Now, a couple of other differences that we have here as well. So we mentioned there about how the artery has a thick elastic wall, the vein has a thin elastic wall, but because the blood is pumped at such a high pressure, there is no need for the arteries to have valves. So if we were to look at a rough vessel in here, so let's say our vein, they're going to have these structures of valves, okay? I'm just trying to depict it as a V. So the valves are going to open and close to prevent backflow. So I suppose if we were looking at it close, at the minute there, it's going to allow some blood to pass through. But once the blood has passed through, they're going to shut off so that no blood is going to flow backwards. We don't want that to happen inside our blood vessels because it could be potentially dangerous for us. Now, because the arteries are pumping the blood at such a high pressure, there's no need for the arteries to have valves, okay? There's no chance of the backflow actually happening. But because the veins are pumping it at a much lower pressure, there is actually the danger there that the blood eventually would start to flow backwards. So because we have the V in vein, we're going to have V for valves. So veins have valves, arteries don't. Now again, kind of the hole towards the centre of the blood vessel, the artery has the thicker elastic wall, so it's going to have a much narrower lumen, whereas the vein has the thinner elastic wall, so it's going to have a much wider lumen. And again, we've mentioned this a couple of times already since the start of the session there. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, so A for away, A for artery, and veins carry blood to the heart. So if a question was to come up about naming a difference between arteries and veins, any one of those four is going to suffice. But just a little tip on that, it's not just enough if a question was to ask, name one difference between an artery and a vein. It's not enough just to say that veins have valves, for example. You would have to say veins have valves, arteries don't have valves. You would have to say veins carry blood to the heart, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So it's not enough just to give one side of the story, you have to give both. Now, we've mentioned valves already. This is going to give us a little bit more detail on this, and the diagram will be much better here to have a look at as well. So valves exist to stop the backflow of blood. Okay, we don't want that to happen because it could be potentially dangerous for us. And we can see here, this is a normal blood flow happening here. This is going to be a vein, and we know it's a vein because it has valves. Arteries don't have valves, but the valves are open. Okay, so the blood is able to flow directly through. But once the blood has flown through, the valves are going to shut off. And it just means that blood cannot go back to where it came from. There's going to be no backward flow of blood. It's going to make sure that we remain healthy. Okay, so the valves are stopping the backflow of blood. We can kind of see here it's depicted with a V shape just to let you know that that's a valve. Now, we've looked at veins, we've looked at arteries. The last blood vessel we have to look at here is our capillaries. So capillaries are only 1 cell thick, so they're really, really thin. And because they are so thin, substances can diffuse in and out of them. So what do we mean by diffusion? So this is the movement of particles from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Now, what does this look like? I should actually mention there as well, that's across a semi-permeable membrane. Now, I'm going to focus on this for a couple of minutes before we come back to the blood vessels. The word semi-permeable there, first of all, if you have something that's fully permeable, it's going to allow all substances to pass in and out of it. Okay? If you have something that's impermeable, it's not going to allow anything to get in and out. Okay? It's fully blocked. But if you have something that's semi-permeable, it's going to allow some substances to move in and out of it. So we'll write a little note of that down here. So semi-permeable, some substances can move through it, or allows some substances to pass through. Now, what does this look like in diagram form? Well, if we have our semi-permeable membrane down here, and we have all of our molecules over here on the left-hand side of that semi-permeable membrane, and we only have 1 or 2 molecules over there on the right-hand side. Over here, we have a high concentration of molecules. On this side, we have a low concentration of molecules. And with diffusion, the molecules are going to move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. So what we should have happening is that some of the particles from the higher concentrated region are going to move across the semi-permeable membrane to the lower concentrated region so that they're balanced out. Okay? Think of it as if you were spraying an air freshener in a room. If you were standing at the front of your classroom and you held an air freshener in the air and sprayed some of it out, the first people that are going to smell it are the people directly in front of you. The people in the back corners, it's going to take a couple of minutes for them to be able to smell it, because through diffusion, it's moving from a region of high concentration, where you've just sprayed it, to regions of lower concentration, which is down towards the back of the room. So this actually happens within our blood vessels as well. And capillaries are really, really useful for this because their walls are so thin. And because their walls are so thin, substances can move in and out of them. Think of them as a semi-permeable membrane. It's going to allow some substances to move in and out. What substances do we want to move in and out of the capillaries? It's going to be oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we want oxygen to be able to diffuse into the capillaries, because then the oxygen is in the blood, it can be moved around the body, and we want carbon dioxide to be removed. Okay? We want the carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood back into the lungs so that we can exhale it, or we can eliminate that waste from our body. So one substance that we have within our lungs is the alveoli. So the alveoli are the structures that somewhat look like this inside the lungs. So that's an alveolus. But the alveolus, which is the singular, is surrounded by this network of blood capillaries. Okay, so these capillaries are going to surround the alveolus. These alveoli are going to fill with oxygen when we inhale, and that oxygen is going to diffuse. It's going to move from a region of high concentration to the lower concentrated region, which is the capillary. And at the exact same time, carbon dioxide is going to leave from the blood vessels, or leave from the capillaries, go back into the alveolus, and then we can exhale that. Okay, so because the capillaries are only 1 cell thick, we can have this diffusion happening. So just to go back to the idea of circulation and kind of summarize what was happening in the circulatory system, our circulatory system is an example of double circulation. We've seen this already. We've looked at the ins and outs of how this actually happens. We're just going to put a name on it now. So it's double circulation because we have 2 different circuits. We have our pulmonary circuit, which is the circuit that deals entirely with the lungs, and we have our systemic circuit, which is the circuit that deals entirely with the rest of our body. Okay, so the human heart is an example of double circulation because it has 2 separate circuits and blood is pumped through the heart twice. We know that already because the blood is going to come over here into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and leave through the pulmonary artery to go to the lungs, and then it's going to come back in on the other side through the pulmonary vein, down into the ventricle, down into the atrium, into the ventricle, and it's going to leave through the aorta. Okay, the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood in the red and blue there are never going to come in contact with each other. They're always kept separate because we have our double circulation, or our double circuit. Okay, so we're going to have a look at an exam question then to kind of summarize everything there. The chamber of the heart marked X pumps blood around the body and generates a pulse. Name chamber X. So we can see over here, it's on the left-hand side of the heart, but the right-hand side of the diagram as we're looking at it. It's down here at the bottom of the heart. So it's on the left-hand side, it's at the bottom. So the chamber at the bottom on the left is the left ventricle. Explain why some of the tubes connected to the heart are coloured in red and some of them are coloured in blue. So red depicts oxygenated blood, and blue depicts deoxygenated blood. So you could just say, in general, it shows the difference in the composition of the blood. Okay, so we're just going to talk now about the blood flow in the heart and how this actually happens. I know we've talked about it a little bit already. We're just going to put it into words down here. So, blood flow. Blood flow, or blood with a lot of carbon dioxide and very little oxygen, is going to enter the vena cava. And we can see that over here. So it's coloured in blue because it has very little oxygen. It's going to enter into the vena cava. It's a vein. It's bringing blood to the heart. And it's going to come down into our right atrium. Now, once blood is there, it's going to be pumped from the right atrium down through a valve, and we can see the valve there. It's kind of the V shape. It's currently open, so it's going to go from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. Now, when the blood gets down here to the right ventricle, the valve is going to close to prevent the blood from going backwards. The right ventricle is going to contract, and it's going to push the blood out of the heart through our pulmonary artery, okay, because it wants to go up here to the lungs. Once it's in the lungs, it's going to pick up some oxygen. And this oxygenated blood now, so the blood highlighted in red, is going to come back down to the heart, and it's going to enter through the pulmonary vein and move into the left atrium. So the chamber at the top, the left atrium. The left atrium is going to contract, push the blood down through a valve into the left ventricle. The valve is going to close off just to stop the blood from flowing backwards. And then the left ventricle is going to contract to push the blood out of the heart through the aorta, and it's going to go around all of the body to deliver this oxygen to the cells. And once the oxygen has been used up, the whole process will start again and again and again. So just to recap, we have our two different circuits. The oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood are never going to come in contact with each other, and it's the contractions of the atria and the ventricles that push the blood from the atria down into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles back out of the heart. So we have an exam question here then, based on everything we've seen up until this point. So the simplified diagram shows the flow of blood through the lungs, heart, and the rest of the body. Name the blood vessels labelled A and B. So A is over here. Let's follow where that is. So it's this one here, which is after getting the blood from the left ventricle and it's pumping it around the body. So because it's leaving the heart, we know it's an artery, but it's not the pulmonary artery because it's in no way related to the lungs. So it has to be the aorta. And then for B, it's this one here, so it's bringing blood back to the heart, so we know it's going to the vein. It's not the pulmonary vein because it's not associated with the lungs in this case, so the only other vein we have there is the vena cava. Down here, capillaries are small blood vessels. Describe two changes in the composition of blood after it has passed through the capillaries of the lungs shown. So we can say that the amount of oxygen will increase because it's going to diffuse from the lungs into the blood, and the amount of carbon dioxide will decrease. What feature of capillaries allows these changes to happen? They're one cell thick, so it allows for diffusion to happen that little bit better. Okay, so they're very thin, just one cell thick. And I won't have space down the bottom there, so I'll actually do this answer up here at the side. Name the chamber of the heart that pumps blood to the lungs. So how or where is the blood pumping to the lungs? Well, it's this one down here because it's going to leave through this blood vessel and go to the lungs. So that's the right side of the heart, and the chambers at the bottom are the ventricles. So that's the right ventricle. So just to finish up with then, we're going to have a quick look at pulse rate. You've probably done an experiment on this already. If not, you will before you get to the end of third year. But when we talk about pulse rate, the diagram over here is showing us how we can measure it. But if we were measuring our pulse rate, it's just the number of times that your heart beats in a minute. Okay, the average pulse rate for humans is going to be between 60 and 100, and that just depends maybe on how fit you are. So normally if you get the pulse rate of an athlete, their pulse rate or resting pulse rate will be much lower, but the average is anywhere between 60 and 100, but it can be a little bit lower or a bit higher as well. So the effect of exercise on pulse rate. Now, if you think about it, what does our blood do? Blood is pumping oxygen to all of our cells. If we're working out or if we're exercising, our cells are going to need a little bit more oxygen so that they can still carry out their job. They're working a little bit harder, so they're going to need more oxygen to help with that. Now, if our heart is beating at its normal rate, our resting heart rate between 60 and 100 beats per minute, that's going to get adequate oxygen to all of our cells, okay, between 60 and 100 beats a minute. If we start exercising, our cells are going to need more oxygen. our heart is going to need to work a little bit harder to get this extra oxygen to all of the cells, so our pulse rate is naturally going to increase. The number of times our heart is beating is increasing. Now, we also have a couple of diseases associated with the circulatory system. There are a couple of diseases, but the one we're going to focus on is coronary heart disease, which is sometimes just referred to as heart disease. Now, what happens in coronary artery disease or coronary heart disease? If we have a look here at our arteries, we can see here this is a healthy artery. We have our thick elastic wall. In towards the centre we have our narrow lumen, but with artery disease or heart disease, we can see here that there's some fatty deposits starting to build up inside of the arteries. The initial fatty deposits will be quite small, but over time it's going to increase, and eventually we can see here that we nearly have a complete blockage. If that was to happen, that could be potentially dangerous or fatal for us. So what is heart disease? It's just the plaque buildup in our blood vessels. It can be caused by smoking and bad diet. It increases our risk of actually getting it. Some signs and symptoms of it will be some chest pain because your heart is having to work that little bit harder because the arteries here are pretty much blocked up. We would have shortness of breath as well, obviously going to be a lack of oxygen there, and we would start to feel a little bit more tired or more fatigued as well. So because we know that smoking and bad diet can increase our risk of getting heart disease, prevention of this is going to be something like not smoking and having a good diet which doesn't have huge amounts of fat in it. So we'll have a look at one final question then, which is going to summarise everything we've looked at today. So the question here says, blood is a liquid tissue. The diagram shows blood viewed through a microscope. Name any two components of blood shown in the diagram. So one of the components there could be the red blood cells, and we're also going to say our white blood cells. You could have mentioned the platelets there as well. So give the function of each of the components of the blood you have named. So red blood cells carry oxygen, and white blood cells fight infection or fight disease. If you said the platelets, you can say that they clot the blood. The diagram shows the human heart. Why has the left ventricle got a thicker wall than the right ventricle? So the left ventricle has to pump the blood a much further distance. So it's thicker to allow this to happen. Now, the diagram shows a person's pulse rate being taken. What causes a person's pulse? So this is your heart beating. And how is a person's pulse rate measured using this method? So we need 2 points for this because it was 6 marks. So you place 2 fingers on a pulse point. So that's where you can feel your pulse. Count the number of beats you feel in a minute. And then you can just record your pulse. Okay, so the number of beats in a minute is going to be your pulse, and you can write that down. Now, just before we finish up, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial of the ExamRevision website. So when you click into the website, you can see here we've Junior Cycle Science currently, but we've loads of subjects on offer for Junior Cycle. We've business, geography, history, home ec, Irish, and maths and science. Now, all subjects are going to be laid out the exact same way. We've video tutorials, quizzes, presentations, an exam builder, and resource packs. Now, when we click into the video tutorials, we'll see here science is broken down into our 4 units. We'll click into biological world to find the ones we were looking at today. They're in biological world 4, and it's the circulatory system. Now here we can see we have 3 different videos: the circulatory system in the blood, the heart and the blood vessels, and blood flow. So it doesn't matter which one you click into, there's going to be a video there for you to watch. All you have to do is press on play.
Hi everyone, so today we're going to be having a look at blood flow within the heart.
And the video will start to play for you, talk you through everything you need to know. Now when you're finished and you want to quiz yourself, we'll tap on the quiz and we'll be redirected to an MCQ quiz based on everything you need to know. So for example, which of these is the most abundant in the blood? We know that's the plasma. We press submit and you will have to go through each of the 10 questions, and at the end you will get a score. So I'll quickly show you this. And we get the last one wrong here on purpose. So we know that's the left-hand side, but I'm going to press right-hand side. And we can see here we got 90% correct. Okay, if we go down here to our result breakdown, we can see we got the first 9 correct because they're all highlighted in green, but the last one there was incorrect because it was highlighted in red. So you can do the quiz again and again and again until you're fully comfortable with the topic. Now, if we go back to the start, that was our video tutorials and our quizzes. We do have PowerPoint presentations there as well, and we also have our exam builder. So you can click into that, and any topic that you would like in junior cycle science, you can tap on it. So we press circulatory system there. And all of the past exam questions and mock questions which have appeared for the circulatory system will be there. And you can add them to an exam for you to print off and try yourself. The marking schemes will be provided as well. Now, if we go back here to the homepage, throughout the year, we also do have a number of live revision courses. So they're usually on the midterm breaks of February, October, we've just had them there as well, Easter, and then in the run up to exams as well. If you have missed these revision courses, you don't have to worry because you can actually go back and purchase ones that have already happened. So if you have a look down through all of those revision courses, you'll be able to see some of them which appeal to you and go back and watch them. They're about 4 hours long in duration, and they're really, really good for helping you with your study for the final exam. Now, if you do want to find out a little bit more about the ExamRevision platform, there is a free trial there where you can sign up. All you have to do is press the start free trial there. We do have lots more information there in our plans and pricing as well. It is a monthly subscription, so you can sign up month by month and get the full content that you need to help you study for your exams. Now, just before I go, do keep an eye on our social media channels as well. So these Saturday sessions are held every Saturday at 11 a.m. So we've had a couple of science ones already. If you have missed them, don't worry, you can go back onto the YouTube channel. They're already there already, all of the recordings of them, so you can watch them back whenever you get a chance. So go subscribe to our YouTube channel, keep an eye out on our social media for which ones are going to be on every Saturday, and I'm sure I'll see you again before the end of the year. So have a lovely end of the day, and I will see you all again soon.